They didn't just ask Claire Whitmore to leave. They threw her out like she was nothing. The sound of the front door slamming behind her echoed down the quiet street, sharp and final, like a verdict already passed. Rain soaked through her thin coat within seconds. In her hands were 2 suitcases that weren't even full, not because she packed light, but because almost everything she owned had already been taken from her. Her phone buzzed once, then went dead. The bank accounts were frozen, the credit cards declined, even the rideshare app refused her request. Claire stood under the glow of a street lamp, watching the lights of the mansion she had lived in for 15 years go dark, one by one. Inside, Grant Holloway was already celebrating. He had won, or so he thought. To the world, Claire was just another discarded wife. A woman who had given up her career, her independence, and her voice for a powerful man, only to be replaced when she became inconvenient. By morning, gossip blogs would call her unstable. By afternoon, lawyers would paint her as greedy. And by nightfall, she would officially be labeled what Grant had always believed she was: disposable. Claire didn't cry. Not yet. Shock held her upright, more than strength did. Her hands trembled as she dragged the suitcases down the sidewalk, heels clicking unevenly on wet concrete. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the city itself was pushing her away. What no one could see was the truth pressing against her ribs, locked behind years of silence and a promise she had never broken. A promise her mother made her swear to keep, no matter how unfair life became. Don't speak, don't fight. Not yet. Across town, in a glass-walled penthouse, Grant raised a champagne glass with a smug smile, telling his mistress that Claire would fold within days. He said she had no money, no allies, and no leverage left. He was wrong about one thing. Claire Whitmore was walking into the darkest night of her life, yes, but she was also walking straight toward the moment that would change everything. And when her name was finally spoken out loud, it wouldn't just stop a conversation. It would freeze an entire courtroom. Claire slept on a narrow bench inside a 24-hour bus terminal, her coat folded under her head like a thin apology. The fluorescent lights never dimmed. They hummed, relentless, making time feel frozen and hostile. Every few minutes, footsteps passed, voices echoed, wheels rolled. No one looked at her twice. By morning, her body ached, but her mind hurt more. She washed her face in a public restroom, staring at her reflection as if it belonged to a stranger. Her eyes were swollen, not from crying, but from holding everything in. She barely recognized the woman looking back. 15 years earlier, she had been sharp, driven, halfway through law school, full of arguments she was ready to win. Then she met Grant Holloway. Grant had loved that version of her at first, or at least he loved what it did for him. A woman who could advise him quietly, correct his contracts before his lawyers did, and never ask for credit. When he proposed, he promised partnership. He promised safety. He promised she would never have to worry again. And slowly, promise by promise, she disappeared. Claire remembered the day she withdrew from school. Grant had framed it like a gift. "Why struggle," he'd said, "when I can provide everything?" She told herself it was temporary. Then came the marriage, the moves, the long dinners with investors where her job was to smile and stay silent. Each year, her world grew smaller, her voice softer, until last night. By noon, reality arrived with brutal clarity. Her phone still had no service. Her email was locked. A notification from a legal app finally loaded, just one line long. Temporary restraining order. No access to marital residence. No access to joint assets. Claire's hands shook so badly she dropped the phone. She tried to call the one lawyer she trusted. Straight to voicemail. She emailed. The message bounced back. By afternoon, she understood what Grant had done. He hadn't just left her. He had erased her. Worse still, another notice appeared. A debt collection alert. A loan she didn't recognize. Her name attached to a number so large it made her stomach turn. She scrolled through the documents in disbelief. Her signature was there. Or something close enough to pass. This wasn't divorce. It was a trap. Claire stepped outside, the city roaring around her, and for the first time since the door slammed shut behind her, panic broke through. If this stood, she could lose more than money. She could lose her freedom. And if she lost this fight, she could lose her child forever. Grant knew exactly what he was doing. He had built his empire by crushing uncertainty, and now he was turning that skill on her. Claire leaned against a brick wall, breathing slowly, forcing herself not to collapse. Somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred. A memory, a warning, a promise sealed years ago, meant for a moment just like this. She whispered it under her breath, barely audible. Not yet. Because if Grant thought this was the end, he didn't understand the kind of woman he had cornered. And he had no idea how close she was to breaking her silence. What he'd done to bury her would soon drag him under. By the third morning, Claire Whitmore stopped being invisible. Her name appeared first as a whisper, then as a headline. Grant Holloway stood at a polished podium inside a downtown conference room, glass walls framing the Manhattan skyline behind him. Cameras clicked, microphones clustered. His voice was calm, controlled, almost regretful. He spoke the language of men who know the narrative belongs to them. "This separation is unfortunate," he said, folding his hands. "But I must protect my company, my reputation, and most importantly, my child." That last word landed like a blade. Within minutes, the clips spread. Social feeds filled with cropped quotes and frozen frames. Grant, composed and dignified. Claire, unseen, unnamed, already judged. One outlet called her emotionally unstable. Another implied financial recklessness. A third hinted at betrayal without evidence, letting implication do the work. By noon, her face was everywhere. An old photo surfaced, one taken years ago at a charity gala. She was smiling then, unaware it would one day be used against her. The caption read, "Grant Holloway's estranged wife amid divorce turmoil." Claire watched it all unfold from a small cafe near the river, nursing a coffee she couldn't afford to finish. The television above the counter replayed Grant's statement on a loop. Every few seconds his voice repeated the same line, each time making her chest tighten. Around her, strangers formed opinions in real time. "Poor guy," someone muttered. "She looks unstable," another said. Claire kept her eyes down. She wanted to scream that none of it was true, that she had never touched his money, that she had built more of his success than anyone knew, that she had stayed silent not because she was weak, but because she was told to. Instead, she said nothing. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a notification. It was a message request from an unfamiliar name. Lena Crawford. The woman Grant now introduced as his partner. The message was short, surgical, and cruel. "You could have left quietly. You chose this." Claire stared at the screen until the words blurred. Around her, the cafe buzzed with life that felt impossibly distant. She realized then that Grant wasn't just trying to win legally. He was trying to destroy her socially, publicly, permanently. And it was working. An hour later, another blow landed. Her former friend canceled lunch. A distant cousin stopped replying. Even a charity board she once volunteered for quietly removed her profile from their site. One by one, doors closed, not with noise but with polite silence. By evening, Claire walked along the river, the city glowing as if nothing had changed. She had never felt smaller. Not when she left school, not when she signed away control, not even when the door slammed behind her. This was different. This was erasure. She sat on a bench, hands clenched in her lap, fighting the urge to break down. Grant believed shame would finish her. That public opinion would crush whatever was left of her resolve. He didn't know that shame had already done its worst, and that what comes after silence is not weakness. It's reckoning. Because the louder Grant spoke, the closer he came to exposing the truth he was desperate to bury. The courthouse smelled like disinfectant and old paper, a place where lives were reduced to folders and file numbers. Claire Whitmore arrived alone, walking through the metal detectors with nothing but a worn leather bag and a calm she did not feel. Her heels echoed too loudly on the polished floor, each step announcing how exposed she was. Inside the courtroom, Grant Holloway was already seated. He didn't look at her at first. He was surrounded by 3 attorneys in tailored suits, their laptops open, legal pads filled with neat handwriting. They leaned in close, confident, rehearsed. This was familiar territory for them. For him, it was another boardroom. Claire took her place at the opposite table. There was no one beside her. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Curious faces turned. Some recognized her from the news, others from social media clips stripped of context and mercy. Claire felt the weight of their judgment press against her back, but she kept her eyes forward. The judge entered. Formalities followed. Dates were read. Motions were listed. Claire understood every word. That was the cruelest part. She knew exactly how badly this was going. Grant's lead attorney stood first. He spoke smoothly, respectfully, painting a picture that was almost convincing. A powerful executive protecting his company, a father concerned about instability, a wife, he suggested carefully, who was emotionally compromised and financially irresponsible. Claire clenched her hands under the table. Then came the issue of custody. The attorney slid documents across the bench, each one another blow. Missed payments, unverified debts, allegations presented as facts. Claire opened her mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand. "Miss Whitmore," the judge said evenly, "do you have representation today?" Claire swallowed. "No, Your Honor." A pause, not unkind but final. The ruling came swiftly. Temporary custody to Grant, restricted access pending review. Claire felt the words hit her chest like blunt force. The room blurred at the edges as the gavel struck. Just like that, it was done. Grant finally looked at her then. His expression was composed, almost sympathetic, but there was something else beneath it. Satisfaction. He stood as the judge exited, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. As he passed Claire, he leaned in just enough for her to hear. "I told you," he said quietly. "You should have stayed quiet." He walked away without looking back. Claire remained seated long after the room began to empty. The bench felt cold beneath her palms. She stared at the place where Grant had stood, her ears ringing, her throat tight. Losing the house had hurt. Losing her name had cut deeper. But this was devastation. Outside, reporters waited, hungry and relentless. Claire slipped out through a side corridor, her heart pounding as if it might break free. In the stairwell, she finally let herself lean against the wall, breath shaking. This was what Grant wanted. Total collapse. No support, no leverage, no future. And yet somewhere beneath the grief and fear, a familiar voice echoed in her memory. Steady, certain. When you lose everything, you are finally allowed to move. Claire straightened slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She wasn't finished, not even close, because the man who just took her child had no idea how close he was to signing his own undoing. Claire expected silence. What she didn't expect was betrayal to come from the one place she still trusted. The email arrived just after sunset, when the city outside her cheap motel room glowed in muted orange and gray. She had been sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the custody paperwork again, reading the same lines until they stopped making sense. The subject line froze her fingers mid-movement. Regarding your case. It was from Martin Keller, her former attorney. The only lawyer who had known her before Grant rewrote her life. The man who once told her, with genuine concern, that she deserved better than silence. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Claire, due to newly disclosed information, I can no longer represent you. I advise you to consider settling quickly. This is not a battle you can win. No explanation. No call. Just a quiet withdrawal wrapped in legal language. Her stomach dropped. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from the court portal. A document had been submitted under her name, a sworn statement, one she had never written. She opened it, heart racing, eyes scanning the page in disbelief. It was a confession, or something meant to look like one, an admission of financial recklessness, emotional instability, a recommendation that custody be permanently limited. At the bottom was a signature, hers, or close enough. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. She read it again, slower this time, her mind struggling to keep up. The phrasing was precise, calculated, the kind of language lawyers used when they wanted a judge to stop asking questions. Martin Keller had filed it. The room seemed to tilt. Claire stood up too fast, her vision blurring as panic surged through her chest. This wasn't just unfair, this was criminal, and it meant something far worse than losing a case. It meant Grant had gotten to him. Her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Claire," Martin said, his voice low and strained. "I'm sorry. I really am." "For what?" she asked, though she already knew. "There are things you don't understand," he said quickly. "You're up against resources you can't imagine. Powerful people. If you keep pushing, this will get uglier." "You filed a false statement in my name," she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. "You destroyed my credibility." A pause. Then, quietly, "I did what I had to do." The line went dead. Claire sank back onto the bed, shock giving way to something colder. Grant hadn't just built a legal wall around her. He had poisoned the ground beneath her feet. Any lawyer who touched her case would see that document first. Any judge would question her sanity before hearing her truth. This was the move that was supposed to finish her. She stared at the wall, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of it all pressed down. Alone. Discredited. Cornered. Even the system she once believed in had turned its back on her. For a long moment, she considered giving up. Then she remembered her mother's face. The way her voice never wavered when she said, "If they betray you this deeply, it means you're standing in the right place." Claire picked up her phone again. Her fingers hovered over a number she had memorized but never used, a number she was told to call only when there was truly nothing left to lose. She hadn't called it yet, but after tonight, she knew. Because when even the law turned against her, Claire was finally ready to unlock the truth that would tear Grant's world apart. The notice arrived at dawn, stamped in cold, official language that left no room for misunderstanding. Claire read it once, then again, her hands steady while her pulse roared in her ears. A civil claim, an outstanding loan, her name listed as the primary guarantor. The amount was staggering, the kind of number that didn't just threaten comfort, but freedom. She sat on the edge of the motel bed, sunlight leaking through thin curtains, and tried to piece together how it had happened. The dates didn't line up. The signatures were wrong. Yet everything else looked terrifyingly real. Bank letterhead, notary seals, a timeline that placed the loan approval squarely during the final year of her marriage. Grant's final move was suddenly clear. If the court believed this debt was hers, she wouldn't just lose custody. She could face criminal charges for fraud. Her credibility, already cracked, would shatter completely. No judge would trust her. No lawyer would risk touching her case. And Grant would walk away clean, shaking his head sadly, as if she'd done this to herself. Claire closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe. She remembered nights sitting at the kitchen table while Grant reviewed contracts, asking her to just take a look. He'd said it casually, affectionately. "You're better at this than my people," he'd joked. She'd corrected clauses, flagged risks, explained consequences he pretended not to understand. Somewhere in those late hours, he had learned exactly how to weaponize her competence against her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail notification from an unknown number. She pressed play. "Miss Whitmore," a man's voice said, professional and clipped. "This is regarding the outstanding balance associated with your account. Failure to respond within 72 hours will result in further legal action." 72 hours. Claire laughed softly, the sound thin and humorless. 3 days to prove a lie she hadn't known existed. 3 days with no money, no lawyer, and a reputation already painted as unstable. Grant hadn't just set a trap, he'd timed it perfectly. She stood and paced the small room, memories colliding with the present. The careful way Grant always framed decisions as protection. The way he insisted on handling finances so she wouldn't have to worry. The way he'd smiled when she finally stopped asking questions. This was the price of trust. By midday, fear gave way to something sharper. Anger, yes, but also clarity. Claire began listing everything she still had. Her memory, her training, her ability to read between lines. And one last thing she had protected all these years without fully understanding why. A name. She opened her bag and pulled out a slim envelope she had carried from place to place for years. Unopened, untouched. Her mother's handwriting stared back at her, familiar and steady. Inside was a single card and a number written in ink that had slightly faded with time. "Call only when there is no other way." Claire held the card between her fingers, the weight of the moment settling over her. Grant believed the debt would crush her before she could stand. He believed she was alone. He was wrong. She picked up her phone, hesitated only once, then began to dial. The line rang. Once, twice. On the third ring, someone answered. "Whitmore Trust," a calm voice said. "How may we assist you?" Claire swallowed. "My name is Claire Whitmore," she said quietly, "and I think it's time you knew what they've done to me." On the other end of the line, silence fell, because a door that had been sealed for decades had just been unlocked. The call ended without ceremony. No promises, no reassurance. Just a quiet acknowledgement and a single sentence that stayed with Claire long after the line went dead. "We'll be in touch." She sat there for a long moment, phone resting against her ear, listening to the hollow silence that followed. For years she had imagined this moment would feel like rescue, like relief. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous, with no guarantee the ground would hold. By afternoon, exhaustion settled into her bones. She walked the city with no destination, passing crowds that didn't know her life was unraveling in real time. People laughed. Taxis honked. Somewhere, a street musician played a hopeful tune that felt almost cruel. Claire stopped in front of a public library and went inside, drawn by the quiet. She sat at a long wooden table, spreading out the papers she carried like evidence from a crime scene. The debt notice, the forged statement, the custody ruling. Each document told the same story from a different angle. "You are losing." She traced the edge of the envelope her mother had left behind, remembering the day it was given to her. She had been barely 20, angry and stubborn, convinced she didn't need anyone's protection. Her mother had pressed the envelope into her hand anyway. "You won't need this for a long time," she'd said, "and I hope you never do." Claire had nodded, tucked it away, and built a life that seemed safe enough to make it unnecessary. Now, sitting alone in the library, she understood the weight of that moment. Her mother hadn't been planning for failure. She had been planning for betrayal. As the afternoon faded into evening, Claire's phone buzzed again. An email notification this time. Her heart jumped before she could stop it. But it wasn't the call she expected. It was another article. Grant had done another interview. This one was softer, more personal. He spoke about heartbreak, about difficult decisions, about how some people, he said gently, couldn't handle pressure and lashed out when things didn't go their way. He never said her name, but he didn't have to. The comments were worse than the article. She should just accept it and move on. Sounds like she's hiding something. Poor kid, having a mother like that. Claire closed her eyes, the words burning behind them. Grant wasn't waiting for the law to finish her. He was shaping the world's opinion so thoroughly that when the truth came out, no one would want to hear it. That was when fear finally gave way to resolve. If she stayed silent now, she would disappear entirely. Not just from Grant's life, but from her own. The trust on the other end of that phone call hadn't promised to save her. They had promised to listen. And listening meant something was already moving. As the library prepared to close, Claire packed up her papers and stood. She felt no stronger, no safer. But she felt different, awake in a way she hadn't been in years. Grant believed she was still reacting. He didn't realize she had stopped reacting and started preparing. Outside, night fell again over the city, the lights flickering on one by one. Claire walked into it with steady steps, unaware that somewhere behind closed doors, names were being pulled from old files and signatures were being compared. Because the call she finally made would soon trigger a response Grant Holloway never saw coming. Grant Holloway slept well that night. In his penthouse, the city hummed below like a machine that existed to serve him. Morning light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off steel and glass, reflecting a life carefully curated to look untouchable. Grant stood in a tailored shirt, coffee in hand, scrolling through headlines with a satisfied calm. Everything was going exactly as planned. The narrative had settled. Investors were reassured. The board was quiet. The press had moved on from questions to conclusions. Claire Whitmore, his soon-to-be ex-wife, had been reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at brunch tables and executive lounges. He smirked. In the kitchen behind him, Lena Crawford leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, already dressed for the day. She had moved in quickly, confidently, as if the space had always belonged to her. Grant liked that about her. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask permission. "You're trending again," Lena said lightly. Sympathy angle worked better than expected. Grant took a sip of coffee. Of course it did. He adjusted his cuff, watching his reflection. Years of control had taught him one truth above all else. People believe what you say if you say it first, calmly and with confidence. Claire had waited too long. Silence had buried her. "She'll settle," Grant continued. "They always do, especially when they run out of money." Lena laughed softly. "She already has." They left together, descending into the private elevator that carried them down like royalty. Grant didn't notice the slight tremor in his phone as it lost signal between floors. He wouldn't have cared even if he had. At the office, the day unfolded like a victory lap. His legal team briefed him on timelines. The debt claim was moving forward. The forged statement had done its job. Any attempt by Claire to reverse course would now look desperate, unstable, reactionary. Judges hated that. "She's boxed in," one attorney said. "There's nowhere left for her to go." Grant nodded, satisfied. Across the city, he attended a luncheon with potential partners, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, projecting ease. When someone mentioned the divorce in hushed tones, he waved it off graciously. "Personal matters," he said. "Painful, but necessary." That night, he hosted a small gathering. Not a celebration, officially. Just friends, donors, people who mattered. Lena moved effortlessly through the room, laughing at the right moments, already acting like the woman of the house. Grant watched her from across the room, convinced he had upgraded his life the same way he upgraded everything else. Efficiently. Strategically. Without regret. What he didn't see were the quiet ripples moving outward from a single phone call made days earlier. He didn't hear the discussions happening behind closed doors. He didn't know that names long buried had resurfaced, or that documents thought destroyed were being pulled from archives. To Grant, the game was over. Claire was finished. He raised his glass, offering a toast about new beginnings and hard choices. The room responded with polite applause, unaware they were standing on ground that was already shifting beneath their feet. Grant smiled, utterly convinced of his own invincibility. And that certainty would soon become the most dangerous mistake of his life. The second hearing was scheduled with brutal efficiency. Claire received the notice the night before, buried among automated court emails and legal alerts that read like warnings rather than information. It wasn't a trial. Not yet. It was a procedural review, the kind meant to finalize what had already been decided. A closing door disguised as formality. She arrived early, dressed simply, her posture calm despite the storm tightening inside her chest. The courthouse felt colder this time, less curious. People no longer whispered when she walked by. They barely looked at her at all. That scared her more than judgment. Grant Holloway entered minutes later, confident as ever. His legal team surrounded him like a shield, murmuring updates, nodding along. He glanced at Claire once, just long enough to confirm she was still alone. The satisfaction flickered across his face before disappearing behind practiced indifference. He took his seat without hesitation. The judge reviewed the file with visible fatigue. The forged statement was already in evidence. The debt claim had been acknowledged. The custody ruling sat like a stone, immovable. This hearing was meant to smooth the edges, not change the outcome. Claire listened as motions were read aloud, her name spoken like an administrative inconvenience. When asked if she wished to add anything, she stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. The room shifted. Grant's attorney raised an eyebrow, almost amused. Claire didn't argue, she didn't accuse, she didn't even ask for sympathy. She simply requested a brief continuance, citing newly discovered information that directly impacted the legitimacy of the financial claims against her. The judge frowned. "Ms. Whitmore, you've made several requests already." "I understand," Claire replied evenly. "This one is different." Grant's attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. My client has already been more than generous. There is no credible evidence to support further review." Grant leaned back, arms crossed, watching quietly. He had expected this. Desperation at the end always looked like drama. Judges hated drama. The judge looked between them. "Do you have counsel now, Miss Whitmore?" Claire paused. Just a fraction too long. "Not yet," she said. A murmur moved through the gallery. The judge sighed, clearly torn between procedure and impatience. "Without representation or documentation, I'm inclined to proceed." Claire nodded once. "Then I ask the court to note," she said, "that I am formally contesting the authenticity of the financial documents submitted under my name." Grant's attorney scoffed. "On what grounds?" Claire met his gaze. "On the grounds that they were never authorized." Silence followed. Brief, uncomfortable. The judge made a note but did not look convinced. "Duly noted," she said. "We will proceed." Grant's attorney smiled faintly, already moving on. That was when Claire noticed something she hadn't before. At the back of the courtroom, near the last row, a man sat alone, mid-50s. Dark suit, no briefcase in sight. He hadn't been there during the first hearing. He wasn't watching the judge. He was watching her. Their eyes met for a split second. The man gave the slightest nod. Not reassurance. Recognition. Claire's breath caught. Before she could process it, the judge announced a short recess. People stood. Conversations sparked. Grant's team gathered around him, confident, relaxed. The man in the back rose and moved toward the exit, passing Claire without a word. But as he did, he slipped something onto the table beside her. A folded card. Claire's fingers closed around it instinctively. On the front, written in neat, precise handwriting, were 4 words that made her pulse spike. "We are now involved." And for the first time since this nightmare began, Claire knew the ground beneath Grant Holloway was no longer solid. The courtroom settled back into its seats after the recess, but the air felt different now. Thicker. Charged. Claire sat perfectly still, the folded card hidden beneath her palm like a secret with weight. She didn't look back toward the doors. She didn't need to. Whatever had just stepped into her life wasn't leaving again. Grant returned to his chair, relaxed, whispering something to his lead attorney. He glanced at Claire, noticing nothing unusual, and smirked as if the last few minutes had only confirmed what he already believed. This was a formality, a slow walk to the end. The judge cleared her throat. "Let's continue." Grant's attorney stood immediately, resuming with confidence. He reiterated the financial claims, the alleged debts, the instability, each word stacked neatly on top of the last, forming a wall Claire was clearly meant to crash into. He concluded by requesting the court move forward without delay. "Miss Whitmore," the judge said, turning toward her, "this is your final opportunity to respond before the court proceeds." Claire rose. For a brief moment, her knees threatened to give out. Then she remembered the card, the nod, the words written so calmly as if this outcome had always been expected. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I would like to introduce counsel." The courtroom stilled. Grant's attorney blinked. "Counsel?" he repeated, unable to hide the edge in his voice. Before the judge could respond, a chair scraped softly against the floor at the back of the room. The man Claire had noticed earlier stepped forward, unhurried, deliberate. Every step he took drew attention without demanding it. He stopped beside her, placing a leather folio on the table. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said. His voice was calm, authoritative, and unmistakably practiced. "Elliot Marrow, appearing on behalf of my client." A murmur rippled through the room. Grant straightened in his seat. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Marrow," she said slowly, "you're entering this case late." "Only on the calendar," Elliot replied. "Not in substance." Grant's attorney leaned forward. "Your Honor, we object. This is highly irregular." Elliot turned just enough to look at him. "So is submitting forged documents," he said evenly. The word landed hard. Grant's smile faltered. The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Marrow, you'll have an opportunity to clarify. For now, please state your client's name for the record." Elliot nodded once. "My client," he said, opening the folio, "is not simply Claire Whitmore." Grant exhaled sharply, amused. "This again," he muttered. Elliot didn't look at him. "For the purposes of this court," Elliot continued, "her full legal name is Claire Elizabeth Whitmore Hale." The effect was immediate. The judge froze mid-motion. Grant's attorney went completely still. A clerk stopped typing. The name hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable, like a key turning in a long locked door. Grant's face drained of color. "Your Honor," Elliot added calmly, "that name is associated with a sealed trust, one that predates this marriage and supersedes every financial claim currently before this court." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Proceed carefully, Mr. Marrow," she said, "because if what you're implying is true—" "It is," Elliot replied. Claire felt the room tilt, not with fear this time, but with possibility. She didn't look at Grant. She didn't need to see his reaction to know something fundamental had just shifted. Because the name he thought he erased was the one about to take everything back. And the courtroom had only just begun to understand what that name meant. The silence after Elliot Marrow spoke felt unnatural, as if the courtroom itself had forgotten how to breathe. Claire remained standing, her hands steady at her sides, while every pair of eyes slowly shifted away from Grant Holloway and toward her. The judge removed her glasses. "Mr. Marrow," she said carefully, "that is a significant claim. You understand the gravity of invoking a sealed trust in this court." "I do, Your Honor," Elliot replied. Which is why I would not invoke it lightly. Grant's attorney recovered first. He stood abruptly, voice sharp with forced confidence. This is a distraction. The trust he's referring to is irrelevant to the matters at hand. Miss Whitmore waived all financial claims during the marriage. Elliot turned a single page in his folio. She did not, he said calmly, because she legally could not. Grant leaned forward now, his knuckles white against the table. That trust was never activated, he snapped. It was inactive, dormant. She never disclosed it because it didn't matter. Elliot finally looked at him. It was dormant by design, he said, and disclosure was neither required nor advisable under the conditions set by its founder. The judge's eyes narrowed. Founder? Elliot nodded. Claire Whitmore's mother. A murmur swept through the room. Claire felt her chest tighten. Hearing her mother spoken of in this place, in this moment, made everything suddenly feel very real. This wasn't theory anymore. This was legacy. The Whitmore-Hale Trust, Elliot continued, was established over 30 years ago. Its assets were frozen under strict legal conditions, including a non-disclosure clause tied to marriage, coercion, and financial dependency. Grant shook his head, disbelief bleeding into anger. That's absurd. It's precise, Elliot corrected. The trust could not be accessed, disclosed, or leveraged while my client was financially dependent on a spouse or subject to marital pressure. Any attempt by a spouse to exploit or control her finances would, in fact, trigger a review. The judge leaned back slowly. And you're suggesting, she said, that this review has been triggered now? Yes, Your Honor. Grant's attorney stammered. Even if such a trust exists, it has no bearing on the debt claims or custody matters. It has every bearing, Elliot interrupted, his tone still even, because the trust predates the alleged debts, and because the documents submitted under my client's name conflict directly with its recorded protections. The judge held up a hand, stopping further argument. She turned to Claire. Miss Whitmore, she asked, were you aware of these protections? Claire nodded once. I was aware they existed, she said. I was instructed never to invoke them unless absolutely necessary. And do you believe this moment qualifies? Claire met the judge's gaze, her voice steady despite everything. Yes, Your Honor, I do. Grant stood abruptly. This is manipulation, he said. She's hiding behind technicalities. Elliot didn't raise his voice. No, he said. She was surviving behind them. The judge closed the file in front of her with a quiet finality that made Grant's stomach drop. This court will not proceed, she announced, until the authenticity of these documents and the status of this trust are fully reviewed. Grant froze. For the first time since this began, he was no longer in control of the timeline. Claire sat down slowly, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with something new. Momentum. Because the name that stopped the courtroom wasn't just symbolic, it was a legal fault line, and Grant Holloway had just stepped directly onto it. The judge ordered a recess, and this time it wasn't routine. It was strategic. Court officers moved with quiet urgency, collecting files, escorting clerks, sealing folders that had been opened minutes before. The gallery buzzed with restrained tension. Everyone sensed it. This case had crossed an invisible line. Claire sat beside Elliot Marrow, her hands folded in her lap. Her heart was still racing, but not wildly now. It was focused, controlled, like something long asleep had finally woken up. Elliot opened his folio again, this time turning it toward the bench. With the court's permission, he said, I'd like to submit preliminary documentation for in-camera review. The judge nodded. Proceed. What Elliot placed before the clerk wasn't dramatic. No grand reveal. Just a thin stack of papers bound neatly, understated, almost modest. And yet, Grant's attention locked onto them as if they were explosives. These documents, Elliot continued, include the original trust registration, notarized amendments, and third-party verification from 2 independent fiduciary institutions. Grant's attorney rose halfway out of his seat. Your Honor, we have not had time to examine. You will, the judge replied curtly. Sit down. Grant swallowed hard. As the clerk handed the file up, the judge began reading in silence. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly with each page. A raised brow, a pause, a longer look at a signature. Claire watched her carefully. Years ago, Claire's mother had explained why the trust had to be built this way. Why everything had to be layered, delayed, protected by people who would never be emotionally involved. Power attracts pressure, she'd said. So the protection must outlast emotion. Claire hadn't fully understood then. She did now. "Mr. Marrow," the judge said slowly, looking up, "these protections are unusually specific." "Yes, Your Honor," Elliot replied. "They were designed for a very specific threat." Grant couldn't stay quiet any longer. "This is absurd," he snapped. If she had access to anything like this, she would have used it. Elliot turned toward him fully for the first time. "She couldn't," he said, "and you made sure of that." The words landed harder than any accusation. Elliot continued, voice measured. "The trust includes a coercion clause. If my client's financial independence was compromised through marriage, manipulation, or restriction of access, the trust would remain sealed until those conditions ended." Grant's attorney went pale. "That means," Elliot added, "the moment Miss Whitmore was forcibly removed from her residence, cut off from marital assets, and subjected to financial isolation, this trust became eligible for review." The judge looked back down at the papers. "And the alleged debt?" she asked. Elliot slid forward another document. "Already under forensic analysis, preliminary indicators suggest the signature was digitally replicated from archived marital filings." Grant's breath hitched. "This court will require full verification," the judge said, closing the folder carefully. "But based on what I see here, the narrative presented thus far is incomplete." Grant stared at the table, his confidence draining with every second. Claire felt something loosen in her chest. Not triumph. Not revenge. Validation. For the first time, the system wasn't speaking over her. It was listening. The judge looked up, eyes sharp. "This hearing is adjourned," she said. "And Mr. Holloway, do not assume this court will move quickly in your favor again." Grant didn't respond, because the documents he thought would never surface were now in the hands of the one person he couldn't control. And the paper trail he buried years ago was about to tell a very different story. The envelope arrived the next morning, delivered not by mail but by hand. Claire was sitting in a quiet conference room inside Elliot Marrow's office, the city visible through tall windows that muted the noise of Manhattan into a distant hum. She hadn't slept much. Momentum carried her forward, but exhaustion lingered in her bones like a warning. Elliot entered without a word and placed the envelope gently on the table between them. Claire recognized it instantly. The paper was old, thicker than modern stationery, the edges slightly worn, as if it had been handled many times but never opened. Her mother's handwriting stretched across the front, steady and unmistakable. Her chest tightened. "I didn't know this existed," Claire whispered. Elliot nodded. It was held under instruction, to be released only if the trust was challenged under coercive circumstances. Claire's hands hovered over the envelope. For a moment she couldn't bring herself to touch it. Her mother had been gone for years. The grief had settled into something manageable, something quiet. This threatened to tear it open again. She broke the seal. Inside was a single letter, folded once, the ink slightly faded but still clear. "My Claire, if you're reading this, then the life I hoped you'd never have to endure has found you anyway." Claire swallowed hard. Her mother's words were calm, precise, as if she had written them knowing exactly when they would be read. She spoke of love without blindness, of power disguised as protection, of men who would mistake patience for permission. "I built the trust not because I doubted you, but because I trusted you too much. You would endure longer than you should. You would stay silent longer than is safe." Tears blurred the page. The letter explained everything Elliot had only hinted at. The conditions, the delays, the reason Claire had been urged to live simply, to depend on no one fully, to never reveal what lay beneath her name. It wasn't secrecy born of fear, it was strategy. "If someone ever tried to erase you," her mother wrote, "let the system speak for you. Let the truth arrive without your voice shaking." Claire let out a shaky breath. At the bottom of the letter was one final paragraph, written more firmly, the pen pressed harder into the paper. "When the time comes, do not seek revenge. Seek restoration. What is yours will return. What is not will fall away on its own." Claire closed her eyes, tears slipping free at last. Elliot remained silent, giving her the space she needed. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. The grief was still there, but it was anchored now, held by purpose. "This letter," Elliot said carefully, "will be entered into record, not as evidence of wealth, but of intent." Claire nodded. "She planned for this." "Yes," he said, "and she planned for you to survive it." Across the city, Grant Holloway sat in his office, unaware that a voice he had never heard was about to dismantle the story he'd built. He had believed the past was buried, that death erased loose ends. He was wrong. Because the dead, when they leave truth behind, have a way of speaking louder than the living ever could. Claire folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Because the woman Grant tried to silence had just been given back her voice by someone he could never threaten, intimidate, or control. Grant Holloway had always trusted paper more than people. Contracts didn't hesitate. Signatures didn't lie. Ink once set was permanent. That belief had built his career, closed his deals, and justified every ruthless decision he'd ever made. It was also the belief that would undo him. The next hearing took place behind closed doors, absent cameras and gossip. This time, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. Grant sat rigid in his chair, jaw clenched, while Elliot Marrow stood calmly across from him, a slim folder resting in his hands. Claire sat beside Elliot, silent. She had learned that silence, used correctly, was no longer a weakness. The judge reviewed the letter from Claire's mother first. Not emotionally, not theatrically, but with the sharp focus of someone trained to read intention between lines. When she finished, she set it aside and looked directly at Grant. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "you've stated repeatedly that you managed all marital finances." "Yes," Grant replied, his voice controlled, "with my wife's consent." "And you maintain," the judge continued, "that all financial instruments signed during the marriage were legitimate." "They were," he said firmly. Elliot stepped forward. "Then you won't object to reviewing one of them," he said, sliding a single document across the table. Grant glanced down. At first, he didn't react. Then his eyes stopped moving. Claire watched the color drain from his face in stages. Confusion, recognition, then fear, sharp and unmistakable. "That document," Elliot said evenly, "is a conditional waiver you signed 8 years ago." Grant shook his head. "That's impossible." "It was attached to a restructuring agreement for one of your early acquisitions," Elliot continued. "You were advised it was routine." The judge leaned in. "A waiver of what exactly?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. He let the silence work. "A waiver of spousal financial obstruction," he said at last. "In plain terms, Mr. Holloway signed an agreement stating that if he ever restricted, manipulated, or falsified his spouse's access to independent assets, he would forfeit any claim to contest their restoration." Grant stood abruptly. "That's not what that was." Elliot met his gaze. "It is exactly what it was." He turned the document so the judge could see. "At the bottom," Elliot said, "is Mr. Holloway's signature. Verified, notarized, time-stamped." The judge studied it closely. Claire felt something settle inside her. Not triumph, not relief, closure. Grant's attorney whispered frantically, flipping through his own files, panic bleeding through every movement. Grant himself looked trapped, as if the floor beneath him had finally given way. "I didn't know," Grant said sharply. "I was misled." "You were warned," Elliot replied calmly. "You just didn't think it applied to you." The judge closed the folder. "Intent will be examined," she said. "But this signature changes the scope of this case significantly." Grant sank back into his chair, stunned. For years, he had used signatures to control others, to corner them, to end conversations before they began. Now one of his own had turned against him. Claire finally spoke. "I trusted you," she said quietly. "You used that trust as leverage." Grant didn't respond. He couldn't. Because the very thing he believed protected him had become the instrument of his fall. And the signature he barely remembered signing was about to cost him everything he thought he owned. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers, each one quieter and more devastating than the last. Grant Holloway expected outrage. He expected argument, negotiation, delay. What he didn't expect was the sudden stillness that followed the judge's order. No raised voices, no dramatic objections, just a series of calm procedural decisions that began dismantling his world piece by piece. The first was financial. Pending review, the court ordered a temporary freeze on disputed assets connected to the marriage. That included several holding accounts Grant had always considered untouchable. The ruling was precise, clinical, and irreversible. His attorney leaned in to whisper reassurances, but Grant barely heard him. His mind was already racing ahead, calculating losses, consequences, exposure. The second blow came faster. An independent forensic team was assigned to review the debt filings submitted under Claire's name. Elliot had anticipated this. The judge had too. What Grant hadn't expected was how quickly inconsistencies surfaced once someone actually looked. Dates didn't align. Metadata didn't match. Signatures showed digital artifacts inconsistent with Claire's known records. What had once looked airtight under friendly scrutiny began to unravel under neutral eyes. By the time court adjourned, the word fraud hadn't been spoken aloud. But it didn't need to be. Outside the courthouse, Grant's phone vibrated incessantly. Missed calls from his CFO. A curt message from a board member asking for clarification. Another from an investor requesting an emergency meeting. The confidence he had carried for weeks evaporated with every notification. Claire walked out beside Elliot, the sunlight catching her face in a way it hadn't in a long time. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply breathed, as if air itself had become easier to draw. Inside Grant's office later that afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Conversations stopped when he entered. Eyes dropped. The same people who once laughed easily now spoke carefully, measuring every word. By evening, Lena was gone. No dramatic argument, no confrontation, just an empty closet and a note that said she needed distance. Grant stared at it longer than he should have, realizing too late that loyalty built on advantage never survives risk. The board meeting was brief and brutal. Grant was asked to step aside temporarily, not removed, not yet, but sidelined. For the first time in his career, he was no longer the one steering the conversation. He left the room knowing the pause was only the beginning. That night, alone in the penthouse that suddenly felt too large, Grant poured a drink and stood by the window, staring at a city that no longer seemed to belong to him. He replayed every decision, every signature, every moment he dismissed Claire's silence as surrender. Across town, Claire sat quietly with Elliot, reviewing next steps. Custody hearings, asset restoration, accountability. It was overwhelming, but it was real. Grant had believed power meant control. He was learning that power without restraint collapses under its own weight, because the system he tried to weaponize against Claire was now doing what it was designed to do: correct imbalance. And Grant Holloway was discovering that the fall from certainty is far steeper than the climb ever was. The next hearing arrived without spectacle. No cameras crowded the steps, no reporters shouted questions. The case had moved past public theater and into something far more dangerous for Grant Holloway: quiet accountability. Claire sat at the table beside Elliot Marrow, her posture relaxed but alert. She wore no statement pieces, no armor disguised as elegance. She didn't need them anymore. The room had changed, and so had the way people looked at her. Not with pity, not with suspicion, with attention. Grant entered late. He looked smaller than before, his confidence frayed at the edges. The man who once filled rooms now seemed to take up space reluctantly, as if hoping not to be noticed. His legal team had thinned. Only his lead attorney remained, flipping pages with forced precision. The judge reviewed the updated findings methodically. Forensic analysis had confirmed the debt documents were falsified. The signature had been digitally reconstructed using marital records. The timeline was manufactured. The intent, while still under review, was no longer ambiguous. Grant stared straight ahead, jaw locked. Then came the question everyone expected Claire to answer. "Miss Whitmore," the judge said, "given these findings, you may pursue damages, sanctions, and criminal referral." The room waited. Grant's attorney tensed. Grant himself finally looked at her, eyes sharp with something close to fear. This was the moment he'd imagined differently. The moment she would strike back. Claire stood slowly. She felt every eye on her, but she didn't rush. When she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and unmistakably her own. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm not here to punish anyone." Grant blinked. "I'm here to correct what was taken from me," Claire continued. "My name, my credibility, my relationship with my child." A murmur moved through the room. Elliot watched her closely, ready to step in if needed. But Claire didn't look at him. She didn't need guidance now. "I'm requesting restoration," she said, "not retaliation." Grant's attorney exhaled slowly, unsure whether to feel relieved or unsettled. The judge nodded. "Be specific." Claire didn't hesitate. Full dismissal of the fraudulent claims against me. Immediate restoration of custody rights pending review, and acknowledgement by this court that the financial narrative presented earlier was false. The judge made notes, then looked up. You're not seeking punitive damages? No, Claire said simply. Grant's head snapped toward her. For the first time his composure cracked. Why? He demanded before his attorney could stop him. Claire met his gaze. Because what you did doesn't define who I become, she said, and because living with the consequences is punishment enough. Silence followed, not awkward, not tense, decisive. The judge closed the file. This court will grant the requested relief. Grant slumped back in his chair, stunned. Outside, as they exited, Elliot spoke quietly. You could have taken everything. Claire nodded. I know, but you didn't. I took what was mine, she replied. That's enough. Across the hall, Grant watched her walk away, realizing too late that the woman he underestimated had outgrown the need to destroy him. Because justice, when it arrives without cruelty, leaves nowhere to hide. And Grant Holloway was about to face a life stripped not by revenge, but by truth. The hallway outside the courtroom felt brighter than it ever had before, though nothing about it had changed. The same marble floors, the same muted footsteps, the same distant echoes of other people's problems. But for Claire Whitmore, the weight she had been carrying for months, years, maybe longer, had finally shifted. She stepped outside into the afternoon light and stopped. For the first time since the door of her old home slammed shut behind her, she allowed herself to stand still without fear of what might come next. Elliot stood beside her, quiet as always. He didn't rush her. He knew this moment wasn't about paperwork or strategy, it was about recognition. You did exactly what your mother intended, he said finally. Claire nodded, her eyes stinging, not from sadness but from release. She wanted me to remember who I was before I became someone's wife. The custody order was handed to her before sunset. Temporary, pending final review, but it restored what had mattered most. Supervised visits ended. Decision-making rights returned. The language was precise, formal, and unmistakably clear. Claire read it twice, then once more, her hands steady. When she saw her child later that evening, there were no dramatic reunions, no tears in public places, just a quiet room, small arms wrapping around her waist, and a familiar voice asking, "Are you staying now?" Claire knelt and held on as if the world might tilt again if she didn't. "Yes," she whispered, "I'm here." That night, she stayed in a modest apartment arranged quickly through Elliot's office. Nothing extravagant, nothing symbolic. Just clean walls, warm light, and space that belonged only to her. She unpacked slowly, choosing what to place where, relearning the simple power of decision. The trust paperwork arrived the next day. No confetti, no celebration. Just confirmation. Assets unfrozen. Accounts restored under her name alone. Protections activated. Oversight established. Everything her mother had built, not as a weapon, but as a safety net, now sat quietly behind her like a wall she no longer had to face. Claire didn't touch most of it. Not yet. What she did reclaim immediately was her name. Her professional record was corrected. The false statements formally withdrawn. The court issued clarification that the financial narrative previously presented had been inaccurate. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough to matter. People noticed. Emails arrived, some cautious, some curious, some apologetic. Claire answered none of them right away. She wasn't interested in repairing bridges that had burned without hesitation. Across the city, Grant Holloway watched from a distance. He saw her leave the courthouse again days later, calm, composed, no entourage, no spectacle. He realized then that the worst part of his loss wasn't financial. It was existential. He no longer occupied space in her life at all. Claire had moved past him. That realization hollowed him more deeply than any ruling could have. Claire stood by her apartment window that evening, city lights blinking on one by one, her child asleep in the next room. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt grounded. She had lost everything. And in the process, she had gotten back exactly what she needed. Herself. But as peace settled in, one final reckoning still waited, because some consequences don't arrive in courtrooms, and Grant's were just beginning. Healing didn't arrive like a wave. It came in fragments, unnoticed at first, tucked into ordinary moments Claire had forgotten how to value. Mornings became quieter, not empty, quiet in a way that allowed thought to exist without fear. Claire woke before the city stirred, padding barefoot across the apartment to make coffee, listening to the soft rhythm of her child's breathing from the next room. There were no schedules dictated by someone else's priorities, no tension lurking in the silence. She had forgotten what safety felt like. The apartment remained modest by design. Claire could have chosen something larger, something impressive, something that reflected the power now legally returned to her. She didn't. Space, she learned, was not measured in square footage, but in the absence of control. She began therapy again, not to unpack the court case, but to reclaim the parts of herself that had learned to minimize, to wait, to endure. Some days she spoke easily. Other days words stayed trapped behind years of practiced restraint. Both were allowed. Grant's name came up only once. "I don't want to carry him forward," Claire said quietly. "I already carried him long enough." The therapist nodded. That was enough. Weeks passed. The city changed seasons around her. Trees along the sidewalks shifted color. Daylight shortened. Life continued, indifferent to personal victories and losses. Claire found comfort in that. The world didn't pause for pain, and it didn't demand performance for recovery. She began working again, slowly. Consulting, reviewing contracts, helping small firms navigate legal gray areas without exploiting them. She chose clients carefully, trusting her instincts for the first time in years. When she said no, no one argued. At night, she read to her child until sleep came easily. There were questions, sometimes, about why things had changed, about why they lived somewhere new. Claire answered honestly, without bitterness, without details that didn't belong to a child. "We're safe," she said. "That's what matters." Across town, Grant Holloway's life grew quieter too, but not in the same way. His silence was heavy. Investigations moved forward. Invitations stopped arriving. People who once sought his attention now avoided his calls. Consequences rarely announced themselves loudly. They arrived by subtraction. Claire didn't track his fall. She didn't need to. Distance was part of healing. One evening, Elliot visited briefly to finalize documents. They reviewed timelines, formalities, and boundaries. Before leaving, he paused at the door. "You've done what few people manage," he said. "You stepped out of the cycle." Claire smiled faintly. "I stepped back into myself." After he left, she stood at the window, city lights reflecting softly against the glass. For years, she had mistaken endurance for strength. Now she understood that strength was choice. Choice to rest, choice to rebuild, choice to stop proving anything to anyone. She didn't feel victorious, she felt whole. And in that wholeness, she no longer needed the past to explain her future. Because healing wasn't the absence of scars, it was the absence of fear. And as Claire settled into a life defined by her own decisions, the final chapter, one of undeniable consequence, was quietly moving toward its end. Grant Holloway's world didn't end with a headline. It thinned out. The first sign was the silence of his phone. No morning alerts from assistants, no invitations labeled urgent, no last-minute favors disguised as friendships. The device still worked, but the world it once connected him to had quietly stepped away. He sat alone in his office long after sunset, lights off, city glowing beyond the glass like a life that no longer recognized him. The company logo on the wall felt foreign now, a symbol he no longer controlled. Interim leadership had been extended. Reviews had become audits. Conversations had turned cautious. No one accused him outright. They didn't need to. The investigation moved forward without spectacle. Financial irregularities, document manipulation, ethical breaches. Each finding landed softly, but together they formed a verdict he couldn't outrun. The board issued a statement distancing itself from personal conduct. His name remained, but only barely, like ink fading from paper. Grant packed his office in stages. First the personal items, then the framed articles, then the awards. Each one felt lighter than it should have, stripped of the meaning he once believed they carried. He left the wall empty, unsure why that detail unsettled him the most. At home, the penthouse echoed. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. Rooms held memories he could no longer control, reminders of moments he had dismissed as insignificant. Claire's calm, her silence, the way she watched instead of reacted. He had mistaken restraint for weakness. That mistake replayed endlessly. One evening, he stood at the window where he once toasted new beginnings. The glass reflected a man he barely recognized. Older, smaller, uncertain. The certainty that once anchored him had dissolved, leaving only questions he didn't know how to answer. He thought of Claire then, not with anger, not even with regret, with disbelief. She had walked away without looking back. No speeches, no revenge, no attempts to ruin him publicly. She hadn't needed to. Her absence did the work for her. It exposed the truth he had buried beneath control and arrogance. Grant tried to reach out once. The message stayed unsent, because what could he say that wouldn't sound like self-preservation? Days later, the final notice arrived, a formal request for resignation, temporary, pending outcomes, carefully worded, professional, final enough to matter. He signed it without ceremony. For the first time in his life, his signature meant loss. Outside, the city moved on. It always did. New faces replaced old ones. New stories pushed past his. Grant Holloway became a cautionary tale whispered among people who once envied him. Power misused, control mistaken for strength, silence underestimated. Across town, Claire lived her life without his shadow. She didn't track his downfall. She didn't need to witness it to feel complete. His consequences were no longer her responsibility. Grant understood that now. Alone in a space that no longer felt earned, he faced the truth he had avoided for years. He hadn't lost everything because Claire fought back. He lost everything because he believed he was untouchable. And the system he bent to his will had finally bent back. Because the end of Grant Holloway wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet, permanent loss of relevance, trust, and control. The morning Claire closed the door on her past, there was no ceremony to mark it. Sunlight filtered through the apartment windows, soft and unhurried. The city outside moved with its usual rhythm, unaware that something final had already happened. Claire stood in the doorway of her child's room, watching sleep rise and fall in a steady, peaceful pattern. That simple sight grounded her more than any ruling ever had. She had learned that endings didn't need witnesses. Life settled into a shape that felt honest. Not perfect, not grand, honest. Claire worked on her own terms, choosing projects that mattered, declining those that didn't. Her name now carried quiet respect, not because it was defended loudly, but because it was no longer questioned. People eventually stopped asking about Grant. When his name did surface, it felt distant, like a story she'd once read but never fully lived. The scandal had faded into memory, reduced to a footnote in business circles. He no longer defined her timeline. He never truly had. One evening, as autumn light spilled gold across the room, Claire received a call from Elliot. It was brief. Administrative. The final confirmations had gone through. The trust was fully stabilized. Custody was permanent. There were no remaining legal threads. "You're free," Elliot said simply. Claire thanked him and hung up, feeling no rush of triumph. Freedom, she realized, wasn't a moment. It was a condition, one she had already stepped into. That night, she cooked dinner while her child sat at the counter, swinging legs and talking about school. The conversation wandered, as children's do, landing finally on a simple question. "Are we okay now?" Claire paused only long enough to be certain of her answer. "Yes," she said, "we are." Later, after the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, Claire stood by the window one last time. The city glowed, familiar and unthreatening. For years she had lived inside other people's expectations, measuring her worth by how well she endured. She didn't need to do that anymore. Her phone buzzed with a message she didn't open right away. It could wait. Everything could wait now. She had nowhere she needed to prove herself, nothing she needed to reclaim. She had already received what mattered: her voice, her child, her future. Claire turned away from the window and walked back into her life, closing the door softly behind her. Not in anger, not in fear, but with certainty. Some endings punish, some endings redeem. This one restored balance. Grant Holloway lost what he tried to control. Claire Whitmore gained what she was meant to keep, and nothing in her world needed to change again for that to remain true. The story did not continue. It resolved, because the greatest victory wasn't winning the case. It was never needing to fight like that again. The story has come to a close now. And if you're still here with us at this moment, then something in this journey must have touched your heart in a quiet, personal way. Maybe it reminded you of a time you stayed silent longer than you should have. Maybe it reflected a moment when life stripped everything away, and you had to find out who you really were without the noise, without the safety nets. Claire's story isn't about winning or losing, it's about remembering yourself. As the Stoics taught us, you have power over your mind, not outside events. And also, what stands in the way becomes the way. Pain didn't break her. It clarified her. Healing didn't come from revenge, but from reclaiming dignity, boundaries, and inner peace. And that's something we can all carry into our own lives. When the world feels unfair, when silence feels like weakness, remember this. Patience is not surrender, and calm is not defeat. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step back, breathe, and choose who you become next. If this story resonated with you, if it spoke to something you're carrying, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, not just entertain. Thank you for staying until the end.